All right. So, when my kids were young, we had gone to the dentist to get their teeth cleaned, and I got into this conversation with the dental hygienist. She was fabulous. Just got into a natural conversation. Turns out her husband was in production, and I was excited about that because at the time I was in production too at my church. I was running cameras. I had run a large 20-foot jib. I had started doing the directing of cameras, running a switcher, and I was very excited to hear that her husband was doing this as well, especially since she told me that he had done it in Los Angeles, that they had just moved into the area from Los Angeles, and that her husband had even produced the Grammys. This was an exciting thing for me to meet someone who was in the industry, because, you know, that's what any production team member aspires to. But she was not really excited about the subject. She said that her husband and her had come here because he didn't want to be in that industry anymore. And so I pushed her and prodded her a little bit to figure out exactly why. And eventually the conversation went around to where she said, why don't you do a search online? If you just look up the words Lady Gaga and the Illuminati. And I was like, okay, what do you mean? And of course, being a Christian, I was open to what she had to say. She said, well, there are some very dark forces in Hollywood. This is, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's been quite some time now. My kids were in middle school and elementary school, and now my youngest is graduating high school, so it's been quite a while. So I go home and I put it in. I do the search, and 3 days. I sat in front of the computer for 3 days. I had fallen down a rabbit hole. It was insane, okay? Some of it was like just really talking about witchcraft. This changed how I felt about reality. Being a Christian, I had always felt like, we were safe in our belief system. There's a devil out there, but there's so much emphasis on God that you don't really acknowledge it. You don't think about it. You don't ponder the idea that evil is as intense as it can be. You don't really consider the idea that there are people who choose the dark side, who pursue the dark arts, and you just don't think about it. And this was my first awakening, if you want to call it that. So my kids, they'd go to school and I would get online. And I'm telling you, I did not leave that computer for hours just with the information that I had found. Crazy stuff that you don't really think about. So, needless to say, this was the beginning of a journey for me, and I felt like God had ordained this conversation and brought me to an awareness about things, especially since, when I was a kid, I had all these questions about the Bible that, going to church just hadn't answered. So, I want to discuss the idea that there is evil. So, there's even yin and yang. There's dark and light. There's good and bad. There are always, illusions to the idea that if there's good, there's got to be evil. It seems as if we live in a fairy tale. Like there's nothing but good. It's hard for us, except when we see the blatant, murder and rape, and all you see is what they show you on the news. And so but the idea that someone would pursue evil for evil's sake intentionally, believing that evil is good in their eyes, I think it traces back to Adam and Eve in the garden. Adam and Eve were put in a perfect place. God created a garden, right? And the garden was perfect, and we were supposed to live in the garden forever. Adam and Eve were to be God's companion, and the companionship lasted for, a while. It didn't really say. I mean, the time that it takes from the creation of the heavens and the earth until the fall of man isn't implicated. There's no real, measure as to how long that was. So we don't know how long they were in the garden. But the serpent comes along and says to Eve, of course, okay, first you got to understand, God had given all the information to Adam. God had told him about everything in the garden, had him name all the animals. God said that you could eat of any fruit in the garden at all, except for the one tree, okay? The one tree, the knowledge of good and evil. So the two main trees in the garden that are mentioned, that are named, are the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the tree of life was food that they could eat. So I would assume that they had been eating that tree. And all the other trees, the only one that God said not to eat of was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he told this to Adam. So when Eve came along, Adam was supposed to transfer that information to her. And I'm sure that he did because, she protested when the serpent came to her and said, hey, look at this tree, isn't it beautiful? Don't you want to eat it? And she said, well, we can't eat it because we'll surely die. And the devil, first thing he does is make her question what God had said. Even though it hadn't come straight from God's mouth, he still manipulated it and caused her to reject God, right? By rejecting what God had said, to think that someone else might have more knowledge and understanding than God did, okay? Or maybe she just thought that she got the message wrong. Maybe Adam was wrong when he told her that they would die. But the serpent said, no, you'll surely not die. You will have the knowledge of good and evil. You'll be like God, okay? So think about this. This is where most religions head towards. The idea that we'll be like God. We'll be gods, okay? So Eve takes the fruit. Then she talks Adam into taking the fruit. And Adam and Eve realize that they're naked. So at this point, we can imagine that everything changes for them. Of course, they realize they're naked. They have this understanding now. Their innocence is lost, okay? And this is the thing that the devil hates the most, innocence, okay? Because when we are innocent, we are without fault. We are close to God. When we recognize our faults, it draws us away from God, okay? So, the devil is jealous of man because elsewhere it talks about how he was God's covering, or his right-hand man, Lucifer, was God's closest angel, the one that was nearest to him. And what happened was the devil had decided that he wanted to be God. He wanted the praise for himself. And so he was jealous when he was thrown out of heaven that God would create a companion other than him. And the companion that he created was Adam. So Adam being created in God's image, Adam and Eve and us as humans being created in God's image, that alone causes the devil to want to lash out at us, okay? It's jealousy. And the fact that the devil wants us to fall as he fell. Hell was created for the angels, the fallen angels, the ones who chose not to do God's will. So, if the devil can get us to choose not to do God's will, then he can get us to go to hell with him. And that's his intention, okay? So the fallen angels are out to get us out of jealousy. So back to the garden. So Adam and Eve, take of the fruit, and God has to make them leave the garden, because he mentions that if he hadn't, then they would eat of the fruit of life, and they would live forever in this state of sin. So God sent angels to guard over the entrance of the garden to prevent Adam and Eve from going back in to eat of the tree of life. So before this, death did not occur, but after this, it was something that was inevitable. So people lived for hundreds of years up until Noah. But they did die. That was the first thing. The tree, eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and being removed from the garden is what caused people to eventually die, because they could not eat of the tree of life. So it was a manipulation. The devil had manipulated what God had said. And God, even if he did say, you will surely die, it was true. We just don't understand exactly what it means when he says things. It's not necessarily in the way that we would think of them. You know what I mean? It wasn't an immediate death, as the devil, implied, oh, you're not going to die. But they did die. It wasn't that necessarily that caused the death, but it was in a roundabout way eventually the thing that caused their death. Does that make sense? So when God found them in the garden and they had already eaten the fruit, the first thing God does is clothe them in animal skins. So this implies that their sin had to be covered up, right, with the death of an animal. So later on, when you learn that the Jews have to do these ritualistic, sacrifices to God to atone for their sins, you realize, wow, that was already occurring. God had set that up for them, even originally from the original sin. So this conversation with the dental hygienist was the beginning of me becoming more strong in my faith, because very early on, there was a video that I watched, and it was a guy talking about witchcraft and describing the ideals behind witchcraft, and that people, it was very much a third-party view on it. He was not participating himself, but he would analyze the ideals, and he was very adamant that these people were truly believing in what they did. I always think about it like this. These people believe that they, if they go to the right location on the ley lines of the earth at a specific time, when the moon and the sun are in a certain orbit and the planets are aligned correctly, and you've got all these components, the blood of this specific creature, and maybe, all the silly little things that you've heard in the past, eye of a newt and toe of a frog, that kind of thing. And that if they do it at exactly the right way and exactly the right moment, then this ritual will work. And to me, at that moment, it dawned on me how much that sounds like faith, The Bible discusses how if you have the faith of a mustard seed, then God, then great things can happen. You could even move mountains, it says. God would do great things on your behalf. He wants to give you the desires of your heart. And so if only Christians had that kind of faith. We need to make it real to us, realize the authority that we have in Christ. When the fall of man occurred in the garden, that was the beginning of sin, right? But the idea that the first Adam brought sin into the world, I came to a point in my reading of the Word and my relationship with God that I was like, okay, so why is it our fault if Adam and Eve made the mistake? Why is it that I have to pay that price? Why am I born into sin if they're the ones who actually sinned first? But the Bible discusses this. It's, that's very much the very reason why God came as the second Adam, to make it all right. That's why Jesus dying is the sacrifice for our sins. Because Adam was sin nature for us, then God is the redemption of that sin for us. Does that make sense? It's nothing you can do. It's what God already did that saves you from sin that you're born into. We're all short of what God intends for us to be. When Jesus died and came back to life, he spoke to his disciples about how he would give them the keys to death, hell, and the grave, and that we now have that authority. When the disciples were in awe of the miracles that Jesus had done, Jesus said to them that greater things will you do than these. So I just feel it's really a shame that Satanists and Luciferians can have so much faith in their belief system, and they really believe that these great things, these miracles of whatever it is that they're hoping for, will happen. But Christians, on the other hand, a large percentage of Christians don't even believe that God does miracles anymore. It's just really sad. Previously, I discussed Genesis chapter 6 and how the angels had made wives of the daughters of men, and the offspring were the Nephilim, and this is why the flood occurred. So, looking a little closer at the book of Enoch, the angels, not only did they take wives and have offspring, but it describes exactly what these angels had taught man, the art of war. And they had taught, well, I guess it would be women. They taught women how to put on makeup, how to do spells and root cuttings, and which is considered in Greek pharmakia, which would be the root word for pharmaceuticals. So basically aspirin would be considered witchcraft, right? Because pharmakia is also the word they use to translate for witchcraft. So in God's eyes, God wanted us to be innocent, like Adam and Eve in the garden. But the angels brought knowledge, which was the knowledge of good and evil. It names the angels, a handful of them, and what they taught mankind. And so there's just all kinds of information there. The book of Enoch starts with this little dissertation, the idea that the book was created for a later generation. And so it was sort of lost for a long time. And within the past, 40, 50 years, I guess it's gained a lot more recognition. When there were fragments of it found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think that's when it really kind of came back into the limelight. So think about it though. The Ten Commandments lead off with, you'll have no other gods before me, and don't make idols. So I've heard Michael Heiser talk about how Deuteronomy chapter 32 discusses how God had divided the angels and scattered them to their own little realms, right? Given them their own kingdoms and everything. And that at that point is when God chose Abraham to start all over. God had created Adam and Eve, and that whole process fell through, so God decided to start fresh with Abraham. And in fact, his name was Abram, and when God changed his name Abraham, the H in the Hebrew language stands for God's breath. So God's spirit, he breathed his spirit into Abraham. And that implies, and he did the same with Sarah, Abraham's wife. Her name then ended with an H. So it was the same breath of God, his spirit indwelling in them. And so the lineage of Abraham and Sarah is Israel, God's chosen, okay? So at that point, this is where the kingdoms, the realms of the rulers of this dark world, right? We struggle not against flesh and blood, but against these principalities, these powers, these rulers of the dark realm that we live in. All around us. You can't see it, but it's always there. So I just felt like this was quite eye-opening. When you piece all the information together and you get the big picture, you start to realize just how susceptible we are, and we're not even aware of the dark forces that are all around us, and how much they have influenced the history of man. And the idea, it starts to give you, some perspective, and maybe even the idea that there could be those that are still pursuing that godhood that was dangled in front of the first humans, the idea that they could be like gods. I think that the devil uses that. He's a manipulator. He's a deceiver. He is, using just enough of the truth to hook you, and then starts to manipulate that truth to deceive you so that he can lead you astray. So the question is, are there really people who believe this stuff? And yes, there are. There are people in high places who still pursue these ritualistic, pursuits, trying to obtain godhood. I think it's the fear of death and having to be accountable for their choices that causes them to pursue these things. The idea that they couldn't possibly somehow get back to that tree of life, the eternal life, and cheat God and his judgment somehow. So that's a whole nother story.